Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week is the very odd story of James Downes, Peter Russell, and the murder of Thomas Vallely, which took place in West Holywell near Backworth in 1870. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify. So I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. There is very little information about the past lives of those involved in this week's case, so I will say that it will be fairly basic. Sadly, this has been the case with quite a few stories recently, which is a shame, as I do like to include a little of the past life about those involved when possible. Peter Russell was born in Scotland in around 1844 and was around 26 years old at the time the crime was committed. His parents are unknown, but in 1870 Peter was living with his brother Joseph and his wife Jane in Holywell Square in West Holywell, and had recently taken a job as a miner at Backworth Colliery. James Downes was born in Scotland in around 1845 and was around 25 years old at the time the crime was committed. His parents are also unknown, and he had also recently taken a job at Backworth Colliery as a miner. Thomas Vallely, I think, is probably how you pronounce that. It's a word, a name I've had a little bit of difficulty with, but hopefully that's right. Thomas Vallely, the victim, was born in around 1835 in Ireland. His mother's name is unknown, but his father's name was James. He had married Bridget Campbell in around 1861 in Newcastle, and the couple had 4 children together, one of whom was only a few months old at the time of his father's death. The family lived in Red Row in West Holywell, and Thomas worked at the colliery in Backworth. And Thomas was only 35 years old when he died. On the afternoon of September the 30th, 1870, Thomas Vallely and James Downes were seen laughing and joking together. They were friends who also worked together. Thomas left the company of James and went home, and James went off to meet a friend by the name of Peter Russell. Sometime after or around midnight, there are a couple of different versions, James went to the home of Thomas and Bridget and knocked on the door. The couple were in bed but shouted out to ask who was there, and James Downes replied. Thomas got up, though he did not get fully dressed, and let him in, but it seems an argument began and Thomas pushed James out of the house, following him just a few seconds later. Within minutes, Thomas was knocking for his wife to let him back inside, saying he had been struck on the thigh and was bleeding. He then came in, got dressed, and went back out to look for a policeman. Thomas, however, would never find a policeman. Instead, he was soon found to be knocking on the door of a man by the name of George Cooper, asking him to let him in before he was killed. George opened the door and found Thomas bleeding from a wound to his head. He tried to bathe the wound, but it would not stop bleeding, and he took Thomas back to his own home, and a doctor was sent for. The doctor very quickly sent Thomas to the infirmary at Newcastle in Forth Banks, and he would remain there until his death on November the 3rd. Both James and Peter had already been arrested and charged with cutting and wounding Thomas, but after his death both men were charged with his willful murder. The inquest was held at the Durham Ox Inn in Newcastle before Coroner Hoyle. Bridget Vallely said she had identified the body as being that of her husband Thomas, who was around 35 years old and worked as a miner at Backworth Colliery. She stated that on the afternoon of September the 30th she had seen Thomas and James talking. They seemed on friendly terms and were laughing and joking together. She said they went their separate ways, and she did not see James again until he came to their home that night. She said they had been in bed when they heard the sound of someone knocking on their door, and when Thomas shouted out who was there, James Downes had replied that it was him, and she said she knew it was him from his voice. Thomas, she said, got up from his bed and stirred the fire with the poker before opening the door. She said he was not fully dressed when he opened the door. She said she did not know why, but the men began to argue. James used some bad language and Thomas forced him back out of the door and went outside after him. She said he came back just a few minutes later asking her to let him in. He was bleeding from a wound on his leg and said he was going to get dressed and go for a policeman. Bridget said she put the bolt in the door after he left, but James Downs came back and he was able to force the door open, and he came inside her home while her husband was gone. She said he hit her on the head with something and knocked her to the ground. He then hit her on the back several times with a pick. While she was still on the ground, Peter Russell came into the house and picked up the poker from the fireplace and left with it. She said James then suddenly left too. She locked the door again and went upstairs to the room with her children, pulling up the ladder so that no one could get to them. Just as a little point, picks were tools used by miners in their jobs, and they often had a wooden handle, and it is to be assumed if James had hit Bridget with one of these, there would have been some bruising on her body. Bridget said she looked out of the window and saw James in the street outside, and he was shouting, "Peter, Peter, here he is." She could not say anything else. Some time later, her husband returned home with a man named George. Thomas was bleeding badly from a wound to his head, and George had been trying to take care of him. Dr. Alexander was sent for, and Bridget said she heard James in the street again after this, shouting, "Send him out and I will murder him." She said he had some kind of iron bar in his hand. After the doctor arrived, she said Thomas was sent to the infirmary at Newcastle. She said he did not return home from there and died on November the 3rd. She was asked if there was any reason for James to come to their house, and she said they had some picks belonging to him and a suit of clothing belonging to Peter Russell, but she could not say any reason for him to want to fight with Thomas, as they were good friends, and he was not planning on keeping the items, as he was only holding them until the men came to collect them. She said it was not true that Thomas had gone outside with the poker in his hand. Robert Ferguson said he was a miner at Backworth Colliery and lived near Thomas and his wife in West Holywell. He said at around 7 p.m. on the night of September the 30th he had seen James Downs in the street near his home, and he had been talking to the daughter of Thomas Vallely. He heard him ask her if her father was home, and she had told him that he was not. He said later, in the early hours of October the 1st, he was awoken by the sound of someone banging on the door. He said he went outside and saw James trying to break the door down of Thomas Vallely's house. He had a large piece of iron in his hand, and he heard him say, "If I can get inside, I will kill Thomas." The iron in question was then produced, and Robert identified it as being the same iron as James had been holding. Robert then said James went away but came back a few minutes later with a candle and asked him to come and help him find his cap, as he had lost it. Robert said they did not find the cap but did find a poker which was covered in blood. There was also a pool of blood on the ground near the poker. The poker was then produced, and Robert identified it as being the one he had found that night. He said he had taken it back to his own house and shown it to his father. Edward Ferguson said he was the father of Robert, and he said at around 1 a.m. on the morning of October the 1st he had heard Thomas shouting "murder" several times, but he did not say anything outside. Later that night he said James Downs came to his house, but he did not say why. He noticed he was carrying a piece of iron. He said he did see the poker that his son brought to the house. It had bloodstains on it. He said he threw it outside, and he saw Thomas's daughter pick it up and take it home. Edward continued, saying he later saw James outside in the street. He heard him say that if Thomas came out he would kill him. He said he saw Thomas going home with George. His clothes were covered with blood, and he saw him later at home in bed, and he had blood on his face and hair, and he did not say who had attacked him. He said he had seen James again waiting outside, but he could not get inside, and eventually he went away. James Whelan said he lived near Thomas in West Holywell. He said on the night of October the 1st, James came to his house. He said when he opened the door, he saw that James had a piece of iron in his hand. He said he told him he had given Thomas what cheer with the iron bar. He said James asked for a candle, and he wanted to find his lost cap. He said he gave him a candle and he went away. He said he saw him again later beside Thomas's house, and he heard him say if he did not get what belonged to him, he would kill Thomas. George Cooper said he was a miner at Backworth Colliery. He said in the early hours of the morning of October the 1st, someone knocked on his door. On asking who it was, someone replied, saying, "For God's sake, let me in, or I will be murdered." He said he opened the door and saw Thomas standing there. There was blood pouring from a wound to his head. He said he took him inside and sat him by the fire. He tried to bathe and bandage the wound, but it would not stop bleeding. He said he continued to bathe the wound until around 5 a.m. when he decided to take Thomas to his own house, and once he was there, the doctor was sent for. Dr. Alexander said he had been called to the home of Thomas Vallely. He said the wound to his head was very bad. He had removed some pieces of broken bone from it. It was very, very deep. He said he had sent him to the infirmary at Newcastle. He did not believe that the wound had been caused by a poker, but by some kind of blunt-edged instrument, and the iron produced could have been such an instrument to cause the wound. Mr. John Rowell said he was the house surgeon at Newcastle Infirmary. He said he had been present when Thomas was admitted on the 1st of October, and there had been a wound on the left side of his forehead, and the skull was damaged. He said that he later performed the post-mortem on the body of Thomas Vallely, and the immediate cause of death had been the pressure of fluid build-up on the brain from the fracture to his skull. Sergeant Winter said he had arrested Peter Russell at his brother's house in West Holywell on October the 1st. He said when told what he was being charged with, Peter had said he had not been there at the time. He continued by saying that he had arrested James Downs at Choppington on October the 2nd, and when he was told what he was being charged with, he had replied saying he had done it in self-defence, that Thomas had followed him out of the house with the poker, and he had taken the poker from him and struck him in self-defence. After the death of Thomas, Sergeant Winter said both men had been charged with his willful murder. Lieutenant Wookey stated that when it was known that Thomas Vallely was much worse, James Weldon had been sent to the infirmary to take his statement. And James Weldon stated that Thomas had said, "I remember the night when James and Peter came to my house. One of them stabbed me, but I do not know which. They were both there at the time. I went into my house and dressed and went out again. They were both there and struck me on the head." But again, he did not know who had hit him. No information was given as to what the coroner said to the jury at the inquest, but I am sure that we can assume that he would have asked them to consider the fact that James was heard by several to threaten the life of Thomas Vallely. And the jury, who retired for only a short time, returned a verdict of guilty of willful murder against both James Downs and Peter Russell, and both men were committed for trial. I did not find any details of a funeral for Thomas Vallely. It is possible, due to where he lived at the time, that he may have been buried in the churchyard of St Albans Church in Ersden. The family do not sound to be well off, so we can assume again this may have been a simple pauper's funeral. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Thomas anywhere in the area. The trial took place in February of 1871 at the Moot Hall in Newcastle before Mr. Justice Wills. Both James and Peter pleaded not guilty to the charge, and as is often the case, the evidence given at the trial is very much the same as that which was given at the inquest, so I will only include any new details. Bridget Vallely gave the same evidence as at the inquest, only adding that when James Downs had been seen outside of her home again on the morning of October the 1st, she had heard him say, "Send him out and I will give him as much as I gave him last night, and I will finish him." She said after this she had thrown out the items that had belonged to him into the street. Robert Ferguson gave the same evidence as at the inquest, only adding when asked that he had known Thomas and Bridget to drink on occasion, and he did think that Bridget had been slightly drunk when he had seen her going for the doctor on October the 1st. However, he does not seem to have been able to say if Thomas had been drunk or not, as he hadn't actually seen him properly. Sergeant Winter added to his statement by saying that the iron bar had been found at the home of Peter Russell and the poker had been found at the home of the Valleys. Both items had been identified as those seen on the night of the crime. He also stated that when arrested, James had fresh scratches on his face and that there were no marks on the face or body of Peter Russell. Dr. Alexander added to his statement when asked if he believed Bridget Vallely had been drinking when he went to their home at around 8:30 a.m. And he said that by the time Thomas was sent to the infirmary later that afternoon, he did feel that Bridget was now drunk. I have to say, at this point, it seems the only reason to establish if Bridget was drunk or not would be to discredit her evidence as to James starting the fight with no provocation from her husband. James Downs did not give evidence on his own behalf, and neither did Peter Russell. And it must be added at this point that at both the inquest and the trial, little to no evidence was given as to Peter's involvement in the crime. No details were given as to the summing up of the defence, the prosecution, or the judge. However, it was noted by the judge that the evidence was much stronger against James Downs than against Peter Russell. The jury retired for a short time before returning a verdict for Peter Russell of not guilty and a verdict of guilty of manslaughter against James Downs. The judge then asked if James had anything to say in regard to the case, and he then gave what was described as a rambling statement in which he said, "I went to the home of Thomas Vallely to get some items belonging to me, including a suit of clothes. When I first arrived, Thomas was not in, so I went with Peter to a public house, where I stayed until midnight. I then returned to Thomas's house, and his wife let me in. I was about to sit down when Thomas jumped out of his bed, and using a violent language towards me, struck me with the poker. I then bit Thomas on the hand. Thomas came outside after me and hit me again with the poker, so I took this off him. We fought for a while, and then I hit him with the poker in self-defence." The judge then spoke, saying that James Downs, by his own statement, had confirmed that he had attacked Thomas. He had not, however, given any explanation as to the evidence given by several witnesses of his desire to continue the fight and to finish off his victim. He stated that he believed that James had been a man out of his senses with drink and had gone about like a madman, and not someone who was simply acting in self-defence. However, he did feel the jury had been fair in not finding him guilty of murder. He then sentenced James Downs to 7 years penal servitude. I did not find any further details of James after this date, and the only details I found for Peter Russell was the evidence of the 1871 census, which was later in the year from the trial, where he was still living in his brother's house. Bridget Vallely went on to remarry in 1872, and by 1881 it appears that she had moved to Durham, and it has to be hoped that her life did turn out better for her after the awful death of her first husband, but I do believe that I did find a further sentence where she had again been widowed. This was most definitely a very strange story. There seems to be no real evidence of why James decided to attack Thomas on that fateful night. No one seems to have spoken of the men falling out. In fact, Bridget stated they had been getting on fine earlier that night, and no evidence was given that he had not been able to get his personal belongings back from Thomas. So was this just a case of James being drunk and taking offence at something Thomas said to him when he went to his house? Although what this might have been, we have absolutely no way of knowing. Or was he simply just drunk and looking for a fight? After he was thrown out of the house, did James wait outside for Thomas coming back out, or did he go looking for him? And if we're to believe Bridget, he does not seem to have known that Thomas had gone back out, as why else would he have broken into the house looking for him? But we also do not know if this part of the story was true. James did not admit to it, and there was no evidence from the doctor to say that he had treated Bridget for any injuries, and surely if she had been hit by a pick, which would have been quite a hard and heavy object, she would have had some severe bruises to her back. Was Peter involved in the fight at all? At both the inquest and the trial, no evidence was given as to his part in the attack. Even James did not suggest that Peter had attacked Thomas. Perhaps all he did was to stand by and watch while James and Thomas had fought. I have to admit, based on the lack of evidence against Peter, I believe the jury were right to find him not guilty. However, I am not entirely sure that I agree with either the judge or the jury that James was only guilty of manslaughter. He was heard by many to say that he wished Thomas dead, and it seems that he had been able to get back into the house, he would have attacked him again. So he was really looking in some terms of wanting to kill Thomas. So I think he should have been found guilty of murder. But what do you think? Do you think it is possible that Thomas was the first to attack James? Or do you think James was drunk and acting crazy and simply attacked Thomas for no real reason? Do you think the jury were correct to find Peter not guilty? And do you think they were also correct to find James guilty of manslaughter? Or do you think he should have been found guilty of murder? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this strange, sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.